Hello and welcome to Social Science Weekly, where we take the most important social science papers, giving you just the facts and none of the spin. The paper we're looking at today has the title, Does Protest Influence Political Speech? Evidence from UK Climate Protests, 2017 to 2019. The paper was published in the British Journal of Political Science in August 2023. And the three authors of this paper are Christopher Barry, Thomas Fleming, and Sam Rowan. And the institutions that supported the work are the University of Edinburgh, University College London, and Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Okay, let's get started. In recent times, the world has seen a surge in climate awareness with lots of protests going on, such as the Fridays for Future movement, which is the subject of this paper, initiated by Greta Thunberg, as well as the controversial protests in the UK by organisations like Just Stop Oil that are designed to disrupt the political conversation as much as possible. Do these protests actually alter the political conversation, though, or is the response to these protests just a whole lot of noise on social media? These are the questions that the authors wanted to answer, but it also kind of bears on much broader social science questions. So, for instance, how much do politicians even care about protests, even very disruptive ones? And can people actually move political discourse by taking to the streets and protesting? These are the sorts of questions that the authors are seeking to answer. And what they do is, in this paper, they look at what members of the UK Parliament are saying around the time of climate protests by looking at what they're tweeting on Twitter and what they're saying in Parliament, so the content of their speeches. Okay, so now let's just explore the data and see what it can tell us and what it cannot tell us. So the authors gathered data from various sources to construct this data set that would, enable them to analyze the influence of climate protests on political speech of UK MPs during the period in question, which is 2017 to 2019. So this data had three main constituents. There was the protest data. So the protest data was the Fridays for Future protests that started occurring in the UK between 2017 and 2019. And these protests had the ambition of influencing political conversation. In order to get data on when and where these protests occurred, the authors got that data from Fridays for Future's own website, which they say is crowdsourced information from all the people that were involved in the protest. And they used, and this allowed them to know when these protests took place and at which locations in the UK. I've linked to the Fridays for Future website in the show notes. The second part of the data set was the Twitter data, and this was used to measure the online presence and communication of the members of Parliament. So the authors collected quite a big data set of 2.4 million tweets from all of the UK legislators over the study period, or the ones that were on Twitter. And this to collect this data, the authors took advantage of the special access to Twitter's database that academics used to have, but which they no longer have. So collecting this type of Twitter data is now actually very, very difficult to do. And then the third and final part of the data was the parliamentary speech data. So this is from something called the Hansard record, which again I've linked to in the show notes. And essentially this documents all of the speeches, debates and questions raised in the UK Parliament. The authors compiled text data. So they looked at all the text in the speeches from 150,000 parliamentary speeches. And this is what they used to kind of represent what MPs were saying, not online on Twitter, but, offline in their job as an MP. Okay, and then what they did was they then compared this parliamentary offline speech to online speech on Twitter. And they were obviously, and they could match up that data for all of the individual MPs. So they knew what individual MPs said on Twitter because they knew their account handle, and they did the same with the parliamentary speeches. But what they had to do, there was a lot of data pre-processing and kind of combining this data all together, which I'll go into now. So the first thing they had to do was they had to identify which of the speeches and tweets were actually about climate change and which were not. And this is obviously not feasible to do manually because there was just so much text to go through. So they used a couple of techniques. So they used dictionaries of climate change words. So and then they kind of expanded out that dictionary using like clever machine learning techniques. And they came up with like a big list of climate related words. And then they introduced a little bit of human validation to kind of filter out words that the authors didn't think were really related to climate change. So it's quite an in-depth process. They use a few different techniques, which is healthy. I've linked in the show notes to the supplementary materials of this paper, and in there you can see lists of the climate change terms that we used. And then, once they had these terms, it was just a case of kind of searching the text of the tweets and the speeches to see which contained these words, and then those that did could be classified as about climate change, and those that did not were classified as not about climate change. And what this all meant was that during the study period, the authors identified just over 15,000 tweets and 1,774 parliamentary speeches that were related to climate change from the 553 members of parliament that they could get this data for. And then what the authors looked at, they looked at two things. So first they looked at time. So they asked, did the Fridays for Future climate protests increase the amount of climate change speech in the days after those protests? And second, they looked at space. So they asked if MPs are likely to talk about climate change more if the protests happened in their particular constituency. In other words, if it happened in their particular community. And to do this, they took advantage of the fact that self-reported Fridays for Future protests usually name the town where those protests took place, and then this town was matched with the boundaries of the constituency that the MP represents. And a constituency is just the area of a country that votes for that particular MP. Then the authors used a statistical regression model to estimate the effect of those climate protests on the timing of MPs' online and offline discussions about climate change. And this meant that and using a regression meant they were able to control for other factors that might influence climate change other than those protests. So making sure they were controlling for things like whether the MP was part of the government, so part of the front bench, which meant that they would have a high status and have high visibility, so they controlled for that. And they also controlled for things like whether the MP had a particular interest in talking about climate change before the protests. So controlling for how much that MP actually gave speeches and tweeted about climate change anyway. And then what they also did was they used something called fixed effects to kind of statistically control for any underlying diversity and how responsive MPs might be to climate change. And then also they use the same technique to control for like temporal shocks that may also have influenced MPs' speech on climate issues. So using fixed effects has its drawbacks. So most notably, it can't really explain what's actually causing these sort of background differences between MPs and at different times. They just know that these effects exist and are not likely due to the climate protests. So it's a little bit hard to interpret. And just one final limitation. All of these protests happened on a Friday because it's the Futures for Friday protests. So we can't actually be sure that we would see something different in terms of MPs' responses if those protests were on different days of the week. Okay, so now on to the findings. The authors observed an increase in climate-related speech as the protests gained momentum in 2019. Specifically, MPs sent an average of 5.9 climate-related tweets per day in 2017 and 2018, which surged to 33.9 per day in 2019. Similarly, in Parliament, MPs mentioned climate change around once per day during 2017 and 2018, and that increased to 3.6 times per day in 2019. And also, after the protest started, the language around climate change became more alarming, with the word emergency tending to be used in relation to the word climate on a much more regular basis. Another finding is that Labour or left-wing MPs tended to tweet and give speeches about climate change more often than Conservative or right-wing MPs, although the difference may not be as big as you might expect. The Fridays for Future protests actually led MPs putting out more climate-related tweets. So it increased MPs' speech about climate-related issues online. And most of the tweets obviously came out on Fridays, the day of the protests, and then the number of tweets got gradually less and less as the week wore on. However, what's very interesting is that the authors saw no effect of those climate protests on the speeches MPs made in Parliament, suggesting this is more of an online than an offline phenomenon. And finally, MPs that were in the government, so MPs that had a greater public profile, tended to tweet more about tweet more about climate change, even in the absence of climate protests, suggesting that it's at the forefront of government thinking. Okay, so wrapping up. So in today's episode, we asked if climate protests like Fridays for Future and Just Stop Oil genuinely influence political discourse in the UK. So to unravel this, the authors analysed speeches and tweets of UK MPs between 2017 and 2019, a period that was marked by a significant uptick in climate awareness and activism. The study used information from the Fridays for Future website on climate protests, and a compilation of 2.4 million tweets and 150,000 parliamentary speeches from 553 MPs. And the findings were quite revealing. As the protests intensified in 2019, there was a noticeable surge in climate-related tweets, and also parliamentary mentions of climate change. However, and one other thing, that the language became more catastrophic with a more pronounced use of terms like emergency. But interestingly, the protests seemed to have a significant effect on the tweets that MPs made, particularly on the day of the protest and the subsequent days, but there was no noticeable effect on the contents of speeches in Parliament. So it would seem that climate protests do result in a surge of political conversation around climate change, but it's largely limited to the Twitter sphere. Okay, we will provide a link to this paper and other interesting resources in the description below. And if you found this useful, please like and subscribe. It helps us out and means we can make more videos. To keep up to date with Social Science Weekly, you can get us on all of the different social medias. And that's it for Social Science Weekly, bringing you just the facts, none of the spin, from the best and most important social science.